So I hear your riding lawnmower doesn't run all that great anymore. Maybe it doesn't start very well, takes forever to crank over and finally start. Maybe it only runs when you have the choke on. Or maybe it sounds like this. Well, that's exactly the issue that I'm having right this very second with my mower. A lot of times these issues are simply due to the fact that dirt and things get into the carburetor and we just need to take it apart, clean it out, reassemble it, and be back up and running. And if you're having a similar issue, I'm going to show you how to do it. You can do it yourself. Let's walk through the process, get this carburetor cleaned out, rebuilt, and get this mower back up and running before the weeds overtake us. I'm Jeff. You're watching Home Built Workshop. Make sure you stick around. What's going on, everyone? Welcome to Home Built Workshop. I hope you are doing awesome today, even if your lawnmower is not running all that great. The goal for this video is to show you that you can fix your own lawnmower. You don't have to let it sit or wait forever for a shop to fix it. It's not all that hard. We're going to remove the carburetor. We're going to disassemble it. It's not all that complicated, especially on these small engines. We're going to clean up all the pieces, rebuild it basically, put it back on, and get back to mowing. I know you can do it. I'm going to show you how. We're going to walk through the steps with my own mower that is currently not running very well. So we're going to fix that. Now, I don't want you to worry if you're thinking, man, I only have a handful of tools in a little toolbox. I don't have a big shop or anything like that. You don't need all that many tools. A couple of wrenches, maybe a couple screwdrivers, maybe some picks and things, but just some basic tools is all we're going to need to be able to rebuild this carburetor and get the mower back up and running. Before we start disassembling anything, let's just do a quick visual inspection, see if we can identify any sort of issues or potential issues that could be causing our problem. Let's go take a look. So here's a little mower we're working on. This is a John Deere LT 160. It's got a 16 horsepower single cylinder Kohler engine. Now your mower may be different, but the procedure we're going to do is pretty much the same. Now, if you're not familiar where the carburetor is, you need to find out where the air filter is, and on this machine, it's underneath this little housing here. So the carburetor is going to be right below that. If you look down here, this is the fuel bowl on the carburetor. So this is what we're going to ultimately be removing in just a few minutes. Now, as I'm looking at this, right away, I can see that this is wet right here. And right here on this little wire, there's gas coming out of there, so we got a leak somewhere. I don't know yet if it's coming from the threads up here or if maybe this little solenoid has gone bad. I'm not sure. I kind of hope it's not because I did not get a replacement solenoid. But we'll find out just a minute. As I'm inspecting the fuel lines, nothing looks wet here. I'm not seeing anything leaking. It's really only from the bottom. So that's definitely an issue. I don't know if that is the whole issue. I don't think it is, but it's definitely something we've got to address. After our quick visual inspection, we already know we've got a leak, plus I'm guessing that there's some dirt and things inside here. We can go ahead and start removing this carburetor. We'll begin by just pulling the air filter off. Now we'll use a screwdriver, loosen up the fuel line for the carburetor. We'll see if we can pop that off there. Fuel line disconnected. You might get a few drops of fuel, but it's not going to come pouring out. If you have maybe an excessive amount, you can take a vice grip and just kind of pinch that off. Or if you have a fuel shut-off, it's a good idea to turn that off. This does not have a fuel shut-off on it. Doesn't seem like it's leaking very much, so I'm not going to worry about it. Now, we're going to use a 10mm wrench and loosen up these two screws. I'm kind of going evenly until they're both equally loose. That way I don't take all the pressure off of one side and risk breaking anything. Don't lose your hardware. Now this carburetor has a vent hose on the front There's a hose clamp here you could disconnect, but rather than disconnecting that, I'm just going to pop this vent hose out from where it's connected, and this assembly can come off. We're going to disconnect this wire that goes to the solenoid in the bottom of the fuel bowl. Now these two little linkages are for two different purposes. When you push the throttle all the way forward and engage the choke, this is the rod that runs the choke. This is the butterfly here that basically closes this up and chokes the engine, allows it to start. This other one is actually your throttle linkage here. So you're going to have two different ones in most cases. If you have a manual choke, you won't have a linkage like this. You'll have more of a cable that runs to a little lever that you pull out, maybe on the dash. I can feel on the back of this choke linkage that there's a little L shape here, so we're not going to be able to just pull this up out of there. I'm going to carefully slide the carburetor off of the mounting studs, making sure that I don't bend the linkage. Oh, and it looks like we have a ground wire here to remove. Your machine may or may not have this ground wire. This is easy to disconnect. I'm just removing the fastener with a wrench. A socket would work equally as well. Now we should be able to pull the carburetor out a little bit so that we can maneuver these linkages around and get them disconnected. This one also has a little L at the end, so you can't just pull it up out of there. There we go. There's our little carburetor, which needs to be rebuilt. This is a Walbro carburetor. Pretty simple little units. Now we've got an open hole here that goes right into your engine. We want to cover that up just to keep anything out of there. I'm just going to shove a rag in mine. Let's take this into the shop, get it tore apart. So we've got our carburetor off. That's the first half. Really not so bad so far, right? Flathead screwdriver, 10 millimeter, and an 8 millimeter wrench. That's all we used to get to this step. Now we can begin taking this thing apart. I've got it sitting on a towel, mainly because, as you just saw, there's some gas that's probably going to leak out of there. So rather than getting it all over the shop, try to catch it on a towel. Plus, once we get inside here, there can be a couple of little pieces. And if we drop them, sometimes they're kind of hard to hang on to. I'd rather it land on a towel where most of the time it'll just stop. If we have it sitting on a workbench, it can bounce, roll. You don't want to lose any of these pieces. So it's good to work on something like this. I like a towel because it tends to grab the small parts. Now the first thing I'm going to do is remove this fuel solenoid at the bottom of the carburetor. Now if you have a little bit older machine, you may not have this, so you don't have to worry about it. But this is the solenoid that's leaking, either from the bottom or the threads. The purpose of this is when you turn off the key, it closes a little plunger in here which basically shuts off fuel to the carburetor. To remove it, I'm going to use a 13 millimeter wrench and just break that loose. This is also where you might get some gas that leaks out, if there's any left in the fuel bowl. So I do see that there's an O-ring on here. Might be all dried out. I'm not going to take any of this stuff off yet because I don't know what we have in our kit. Hopefully those parts are in there. Now we need to remove the fuel bowl. This is where we're going to be able to get to most of the parts and the little passages and things. There's really not a whole lot up here to take out. We've got an adjustment for the idle speed, and really that's about it. Most of the stuff we're going to worry about is inside this fuel bowl. Probably dirt too. I'm going to try this strap wrench. I don't know if this is going to work. I've never tried this before on a fuel bowl. Look at that. Now these fuel bowls are just press fit. You don't have to unscrew anything. You just need to pop that bowl off. A lot of times you can just get in there very carefully with a screwdriver and pop it loose. This is the fuel float. We want to be very careful with this, that we don't damage it. This looks like it's the plastic one. We're just going to go jump right in and start disassembling. I'm going to remove this pin that holds the float. The float comes out, and be very careful at this step because if you'll notice, the needle comes out as well. That just fits in a groove here. This needle is what controls when the fuel is coming into the fuel bowl as the engine's running. Of course, this float is in this sort of configuration, and as the float drops down, as the engine consumes fuel, the needle faces up this way. The needle drops down as well, and that lets fuel flow in. When the float rises, it pushes the needle back up into the seat. That's what it's called, the seat. You got the needle and the seat. That stops the fuel flow into the bowl until the engine uses more, and that's how it regulates the fuel level in the fuel bowl. We're about ready to start cleaning this up, which means removing these old gaskets. Before I start peeling those off, I want to take a look at my rebuild kit, make sure that all the right gaskets are there. I've got my rebuild kit here that I ordered up for my particular machine. You can see it's for the Kohler engine. Everything looks right, but let's pop this open. Make sure you get the correct kit for your particular machine. And if you're wondering where's a good place to get stuff from, well, I order my stuff, it's a John Deere, but I order my stuff from a place called Green Parts Store, and this is not at all sponsored. They're a John Deere, basically, dealer, service center. And they have all the stuff. You can look it up by make and model. Works really well. Again, not sponsored, but that's where I get my parts from. But really, you can order these up. I've ordered rebuild kits from Amazon and lots of different places, as long as you know it's for the right motor that your machine has. So, looking at the parts in the kit, there's our gasket for there. There's our gasket for there. There's a little rubber gasket that goes for the fuel bowl. We've got a new needle. A couple other O-rings, I believe. One might be for that, I'm thinking. So that's a good thing. Looks like all the parts are correct, so I'm going to go ahead and start peeling these gaskets off. Really, I just start out by hand, and most of the time they're stuck on there. They don't come off for nothing. So we're going to have to scrape. Yay! It's almost as fun as sanding. Here I'm using a razor blade scraper to really get in there. If you use a tool like this, just be very careful. Keep your fingers where they're safe in case the blade slips. Because, well, I'm sure you can imagine what could happen. We're trying to fix a lawnmower, not end up with stitches. We just want to get all this old gasket material off of there as much as we can before we really start spraying this out with carburetor cleaner. Once I get the majority of the old gaskets scraped off, I'll switch over to just a single-edged razor blade and finish scraping the rest. We want these surfaces to be clean and free from any residue. Anything that's left on there could potentially prevent the new gaskets from sealing correctly, so it's important to get these surfaces nice and clean. Now let's take this thing outside and blast it all off with carb cleaner. To clean this up, I'm just using a can of carbon choke cleaner that I picked up at the auto parts store. It's very important at this step to wear safety glasses. There's a lot of little passages and different angles and corners of this thing, and it's not uncommon as you're spraying this to have some of that stuff come back at a weird angle. You don't want to get that stuff in your eye. The goal here is to get every speck of dirt out of there that you can. You want to make sure you spray into every little crevice, every little port passage from all sorts of directions and get this thing nice and clean. While you're watching me clean out the carburetor, I'd like to say thanks for clicking on this video. I appreciate it. I hope it helps you get your lawnmower back up and running, and maybe this is the first time you've ever visited the Home Built Workshop YouTube channel. If that's the case, welcome. We have all kinds of different sorts of videos here on the channel. I hope you find them helpful. And if you do, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I'd love to have you on as a subscriber, following along on all the different projects. We have a wide variety of content here. I like to do a lot of different things and share that journey along with you. So again, thank you for checking out this video. Let's get back, get this carburetor back together and the lawnmower back up and running. After cleaning everything out with carb cleaner, now I want to take some compressed air. But before I do that, I probably should add that it's probably a good idea to wear some gloves when you do that. Now, I didn't wear them just a second ago because I totally forgot, but you're going to get this carb cleaner all over you. And if you're sensitive to things like that, it may, I don't know, take it for what it's worth. But it's a good idea to wear gloves, even though I just didn't. When using the compressed air, I treat this just like I do with the carb cleaner. I want to blow out all of the passages from every single direction and make sure that air flows freely throughout the entire carburetor. Because if air won't go through, fuel's not going to go through later. The last thing I want to do before reassembly is remove this rubber gasket that seals the fuel bowl in place. Just make sure that there's no residue left from that. We want to make sure we get a good seal. Not leaking fuel. And here again, I'm using a razor blade as a scraper to make sure there's no crud in the groove where the O-ring's going to sit. Now that every single passage we can possibly find has air and carburetor cleaner flowing through it cleanly, we're ready to start reassembling this. The only thing that we really weren't able to remove is this mixture screw here, and that's because it has a plastic cap on there that limits the adjustment. Now, it is possible to remove that cap so that you can get that screw out of there, but sometimes those don't go back on the way you might think. So I'm right now opting to not remove that. There's nothing in there really you can do except clean it off anyway and put it right back on. There's no replaceable parts there. So I'm going to leave that as is. Let's put this back together. The first piece I'm going to put on is going to be this new rubber gasket, which will seal the fuel bowl once we reinstall that. That just pops into place. The bowl goes on there. Next, we'll reinstall the float and the needle. Now, this particular kit for this carburetor comes with two different needles. If I inspect them, they're not quite the same. This one, when I compare it to this one here, this is the one that I want to use. Now, your kit might be different, but just make sure if it comes with a needle and you're going to replace it, that the new one matches the old one. This one even has a note in here that says this is for a carburetor with a brass seat. I believe this little O-ring, this little rubber gasket, is the seat if you had that particular carburetor model. If I look down in here, there's no O-ring down in there, and that's a brass seat. So I'm going to use this one. My old one, set that aside so I don't mix them. Now remember when we took this out, that the needle sits in that little groove so that it hangs like this from the bottom of the float. Then you're going to carefully drop that down in there. And slide the pin in. There's no retainer on the pin because once the fuel bowl's in place, it can't slide out. It's kind of captured by the fuel bowl. This just pops back on. I should have mentioned that when I took it off. I'm not unscrewing it because it doesn't screw on. It just pops in there. It's actually held in place by this solenoid, which we're going to install next. See, that's really just kind of sitting there. If I push on it, it doesn't really go any farther, so I know that that's seated all the way. This solenoid has an O-ring right here. The kit comes with a new one. I'm hoping that that's what's leaking when we saw that fuel leak before we removed the carburetor. I have a feeling it was. One last thing I want to show you is what happens if you just have a carburetor and you're not exactly sure what it is. I don't know why you'd have a spare laying around, but sometimes you do. I know I've been in that boat before. Once you get it cleaned up, when you start looking at the casting, you can find usually the manufacturer on there. So right here is right into the casting. It says Walbro, so I automatically know that it's a Walbro carburetor. On the other side, there are some serial numbers, probably date codes and things right here. And right above that in the casting, it says LMK. LMK is basically the series. So this is a Walbro LMK carburetor. That way, if I need particular parts, I can just go on the old Googles and search Walbro LMK, find all the diagrams, any information that I might need. So now, everything's cleaned up. We've got a couple new parts installed, some new seals. Let's grab our new gaskets and go reinstall this. As you probably guessed, installation is, well, exactly reverse of removal. Make sure our gasket surface is nice and clean. First, we'll work our linkage back into place. This is possibly the trickiest part. It's never a bad idea to take a picture of this linkage before you remove the carburetor. That way at this step, if you get confused with how it should go, you can refer to that picture. Gasket goes on. Trying to be careful not to bend those rods because that's not good. Fuel line, outer gasket, our little ground wire, now we can reinstall the portion that the air filter connects to, making sure to remember to reconnect to this vent hose. Vent hose is back where it came from. Reinstall those nuts. We'll tighten this down. Resecure our fuel line. And reconnect the electrical connector for our solenoid. I'm going to go ahead and wipe this off down here because we knew we had a leak earlier. I want it to be nice and clean. That way we can very easily tell if we have another leak. And I'm going to reinstall the air filter just because I don't like to start it without the air filter, but you can if you want. Just don't run it without the air filter. I think we're ready to crank this over and fire it up. Just keep in mind that there's no fuel right now in the fuel bowl, so it may crank for a few seconds more than it normally would because it has to fill that fuel bowl. take a look. There's no fuel leaking. It's idling okay. Before it wouldn't idle, it would just die. Well, I'm gonna call that a win. It's running, no fuel leaking. I gotta get back to work and get this grass mowed. Thanks a lot for watching. I hope you found this helpful. If you need to rebuild or clean the carburetor on your lawnmower, this applies to not just this model, but just about every model of lawnmower has a very similar carburetor. The procedure is going to be almost identical. Thanks a lot for watching. We'll see you next time.